Hey guys, welcome back to Dogforge. My name's Paul, and today we're going to get the first episode of our Optimizing 5e series where we take a look at the nitty-gritty of how you can get the most out of your 5e characters. Now, this is also not going to dive in just to specific tricks and builds. Builds themselves will still be held in the build playlist, and they are coming back. Do not fret, there are several on the hob at the moment. Now, this will also cover various concepts and constructs that arise from the optimization community and discussing how much water they actually hold, which is what this video is about. In this video we're going to be talking about damage baselines in 5e. What are they? Are they a good thing? Examples including one of the most commonly reported baselines. Now, some disclaimers. This is of course all my opinion. If you spot an error in my math, oops. If you spot an error on screen, please let me know down in the comments below, but I don't think any errors will drastically change the outcome, and I know it will not change my opinion of it, as it's just an error creating the document. And in terms of what's going to go forwards, it is of course going to have some of my personal bias, but my bias is informed entirely by 5e. Unlike some other YouTubers that use kind of baselines, I don't tend to use baselines in my build videos. I don't think that it's a particularly healthy thing to do, and it's often coming from people with prior edition experience that are used to large numbers and that kind of thing. So there you go. I'm a 5e baby, and that informs all of my opinions, right or wrong. So let's get into it. What are baselines? A baseline is a touch point, a reference point for various things. In this specific instance, we're talking about damage. Now, the general concept is that you would have a damage baseline from an example build, and that would give you a threshold that should go through the various levels, and your goal is to meet, preferably exceed, that baseline so that you can see that you're doing enough damage. Now, if you couldn't hear that, I'm using air quotes because here's a secret that I'll come back to at the end as well. It's really hard to make a bad character in 5e, no matter what you're doing, unless you deliberately sabotage yourself intentionally. It's very hard to not be constructive and actually contribute to your party. So just because you don't meet some baseline on some YouTube channel, forum post, whatever, doesn't really matter. What matters is your enjoyment of the game, and in my opinion, your enjoyment should not be informed by this artificial baseline construct that other people have just thrown together. So with that in mind, what should you use a baseline? It can be useful in certain instances. Now, what I would consider a more useful baseline is a party baseline, is looking at your party as a whole when people have an idea what characters they want to play, and then using that to inform your baseline. Am I doing enough damage so that I don't feel like I'm bottom of the pack the entire time when damage is something I'm meant to be doing? I'm not healing much, I'm not doing much control stuff. Damage is my central role, so am I keeping up with the pack that I'm actually playing with? I think that is the most useful thing, really, because at the end of the day, you're playing with a limited group of people. You're not playing with the collective build collection of the internet. So I think baselining yourself against your fellow party members with your role in mind is actually going to be the most helpful for informing how much fun you're going to have. I do understand that you cannot always do that. Not everyone knows what they're playing in advance. You might be playing with strangers, you might be playing Adventurers League, and baselines can help in that instance, and I'm going to show you in the end the baseline that I prefer if you want to use a baseline. So that all said, let's jump in and take a look at the most egregious baseline, in my opinion, that gets thrown around quite a lot. That is the warlock. Now, also a disclaimer about my math. My math is not including critical hits or accuracy. There is really no point to include accuracy in these particular baselines anyway, and that's the kind of thing I tend to avoid because it does lead to some silliness in some extremes. All of these characters should have the same modifier to hit, so that should be the same regardless. Critical hits do matter, particularly for the rogue example that will be coming up. Critical hits for the rogue are going to be more impactful for either the warlock or fighter examples. As long as you understand those things, you don't need to know the particular numbers. As long as you understand, hey, the rogue is going to surge up more in numbers when they crit than these other things making multiple attacks. So, the warlock in question is any old warlock with Eldritch Blast, Agonizing Blast, and Hex. So let's take a look what that looks like. And I have here just the relevant levels for when things increase. So we start off with 1d10 plus a d6 from Hex for 9 damage. These are the averages. Level 2, you pick up Agonizing Blast, so you can now start adding your +3 Charisma modifier. And the assumption here is that at level 4 and level 8 you will be increasing with your ASI the relevant stat. At level 4 we go up to 13 damage as you bump your Charisma. Level 5 we get an extra beam, so that doubles. Level 8 to 10 we get up to 28 as you boost your Charisma again, getting another +2. Level 11 you're going to get another beam, making that 42, and at level 17 you get your fourth and final beam, making it 56. Now, depending on what your exposure is to D&D, these numbers seem like quite high, especially if you've not played in these kinds of tiers before. This seems quite high, and this number here can seem quite high too. So, what about this is a problem? Well, in my opinion, the problem firmly lies in a couple of primary reasons, but this is the main one right here: Hex. The argument given is that this is a very low threshold for somebody to achieve. It's obvious. It is the smallest amount of optimization knowledge. It's very intuitive to do because it's the design intent of the warlock. By intent, I don't mean you have to do that. I mean that it is an obvious path to damage with the warlock. Now, Hex will get thrown around because it has a long duration that gets longer as your slots increase, and so you have to upcast it. With the argument being that it can last through multiple encounters, even go through rests later on, which does depend on your DM. Not all DMs allow you to concentrate through spells through rests. And so if you do drop it, you have another slot to cast it back up, and you'll be at range anyway. You're not likely to get hit. Concentration saves are easy to pass. You can get resilient constitution. You can get warcast. You can do all these things. You just apply Hex. It's easy. I firmly disagree with this. So first of all, the aspect of that a baseline should be going for is resourceless damage. It is not. We are not baselining novas, and typically when this is used, it is not baselining novas. A baseline, and this is my opinion, should not have resources included. It does not matter how abundant that resource is for the most part. It does not matter how long those resources last. You are making the assumption that the character will spend those resources, and that becomes problematic when you then compare that build against other characters and whether or not they spend resources and when they spend resources. So just anything that is actually a renewable resource that you spend included in a baseline is a mistake, in my opinion. I think it misses the point, and it tends to inflate the numbers. Hex itself is problematic, not just because you need to maintain concentration on it, which is far from guaranteed, but also it needs setup. You need to use your bonus action to apply it, and Eldritch Blast has a much longer range than Hex does. that can obviously lead to situations where you might be able to Eldritch Blast somebody, but you might not be able to Hex them first. You might argue that that's a unlikely scenario, that most combat starts for most tables within that 60, I believe it's 60 feet range. 90 feet, so within that 90 feet range, and you can move your 30 feet to make up that difference. There probably won't be difficult terrain, you probably won't put yourself in melee peril by doing so. There's all kinds of arguments, but the point is that this is a situation where it falls down. The next is, as you get more blasts, it assumes that you can still have Hex applied on the subsequent blasts. For that to actually matter, it means that you are either hitting the same person with multiple blasts, you have not killed them, or if you have killed them, you've killed them on a subsequent turn from when you initially hexed them, so that you have a bonus action available to move it to your next target. This gets increasingly problematic the more blasts you get from Eldritch Blast. And overkill is a problem with anything regarding Hex, and to a lesser extent Hunter's Mark. As soon as you have your bonus action tied to moving around your source of damage, you can no longer guarantee that that damage is going to apply to all of your attacks. So when you start seeing math like I've presented here, where as you get a blast you're just multiplying Hex, that's not actually how it's going to play out in many situations. You can lose concentration, you might not be in range, your Hex might get dispelled, might get counterspelled. You might just not have it applied because you killed the previous person. So this is not only problematic because it creates imbalance in comparisons and inflates numbers, but it becomes problematic because it's unreliable. And that is a problem. That's a significant problem. Now you might be thinking, yes, but there's still the majority of time. The issue is that it's unreliable enough for this to be a talking point. And I've not even named all the circumstances, so just throw another one out there. What if the creature is invisible? Or is in the dark and you don't have dark vision or devil sight? Which might get thrown out, well hey, why wouldn't you have devil sight? You're a warlock. Which comes to one of our next problems, which is Agonizing Blast. Now, Agonizing Blast, in my opinion, also leads to a little bit of contention. Invocations are intended for a warlock to make up the gap between their lack of spell slots and other spellcasters. And by choosing something like Agonizing Blast, yes, you are upping your damage contribution, but you are doing so at the sacrifice of then having utility invocations. An invocation you spend on Agonizing Blast, it means it's one not spent on Devil's Sight, Fiendish Vigor, Eyes of the Runekeeper, whatever you want, and then as you get your pact and more invocations become available to you, this gets harder. And you might say, well yes, but they get 2 straight away, it's only one of them, and they're going to get more as you level up. That's not the point. The point is that by just writing off Agonizing Blast, that warlock is sacrificing other aspects of their character. And that matters for the warlock. In a way, it doesn't matter for other classes. That's just inherent to the warlock's design. Invocations are a significant part of their chassis. If you want to dedicate yourself to damage, that's fine. But typically this is used to represent a warlock that is not really focusing on damage. It's portrayed to be low-hanging fruit that every warlock will do, and not every warlock does do it, or really should do it, depending on what their concept is. Now this does contrast with fighting styles, because fighting styles typically are a much smaller part of a marshal's overall kit. Not all marshals even get them. And fighting styles are very narrow in application. They are all combat related. You could argue that something like superior technique can let you pick up the out of combat battlemaster maneuvers, but that's an edge case. Fighting styles are combat focused. Invocations are not inherently. And that is why I find that secondly problematic. This is also an outlier. Not all casters do this. Cantrips in general tend to be significantly worse than this. By using the warlock, which is an outlier by design because of their spell slot design, you again create issue with comparing the at-will damage of other classes. Now you might want this, you might want the high numbers. You know, you might want to set that baseline to beat to feel good, but that's your choice. That does not mean that it's a good baseline for other people to use. So, what are some alternatives to the warlock? Well, we do have the rogue. Rogues are even more straightforward than the warlock. You don't have to do anything. Sneak attack is built in and scales regardless of your decisions, as long as you don't multi-class out. In this particular example, the only optimization I've done is choose a rapier. That's it. And the numbers are lagging behind for the most part with, let's see, so 9, 12, 13, 26. We start off ahead of the warlock, but then we do drop off, just because when you're using something like Eldritch Blast, which scales so significantly, particularly when you add Hex in as a multiplier, it's really hard to find at-will damage, and again, I'm talking at-will damage, that really does compete against that, because it is an outlier by design. This gives you a starting point at level 1 of 11, and an ending point at level 19 when sneak attack stops scaling of 44.5. Again, we're dealing in averages here, and this does not take into consideration the larger amount of crits. Not the larger amount of, but the more significant impact of crits on a rogue. And then there's other factors that need to be considered between the rogue and the warlock, being that the warlock is going to be more reliable in inflicting some degree of damage because they're making multiple attacks. They get more attacks as the levels increase, whereas rogues are more dependent on getting single attacks, and they're not always going to get sneak attack. And I personally disagree with assuming that rogues will always get sneak attack, but it is easy enough for them to get that it should be most of the time. A rogue should be getting sneak attack like 80% plus of the time, because it's the design that's expected. But that's also mitigatable. When you're comparing these two things, you can also say, well, yes, the rogue can miss their attack and they can not get any damage, but you can also trade 1 damage on average from the attack itself, go down to 2 short swords and 2 weapon fight, giving you 2 chances to land the majority of your damage, versus the warlock, whose damage is divided up into equal pieces. So there is some nuance here. I've chosen the rapier just because it is the optimized version of this in terms of single hit damage. If you went for short sword 2 weapon fighting, these numbers would be a skosh higher. You would add on another 2.5 to all of the numbers represented here, which makes it a little more comparable. So what that makes, so that would go for 26 at level 8 versus 28. So it does make it more comparable if you go 2 weapon fighting. That's not the mental image a lot of rogues have, and it is a little prohibitive for some rogue playstyles if you're a arcane trickster and you need your hand for components, be it somatic or material, or perhaps you're a thief and you want your hand free so that you can start throwing some caltrops and ball bearings and oil and all kinds of things. Two-weapon fighting isn't always on the table for all rogues for various reasons. Again, these are not the highest numbers possible for these classes. None of these classes have subclasses. They can both go much higher. None of them have feats. Feats can also put them higher. Well, at the very least, feats can put the rogue and the fighter upcoming higher. So the rogue is a more, in my opinion, applicable baseline. The numbers are lower and so more reasonable. The amount of assumptions you have to make about the rogue is far fewer. There's no decisions the rogue really has to make besides weapon choice. They're going to get sneak attack damage built in as long as they qualify, and they're going to qualify for it most of the time unless something is going wrong. And if your rogue is not getting sneak attack most of the time, then that is either an issue with the player not understanding, the player making deliberate decisions against it, or the DM perhaps making environments not conducive to rogues. And you can do this differently. I've chosen a rapier because despite a lot of talk on the internet and various optimization places of rogues using short bows, which can then subsequently use steady aim to get advantage at will, most rogues that I've seen in actual play tend to be melee. People want to use the knives, they want to use the swords, they want to be, dashing in and out of combat, using cunning action and whatnot. That's just my experience, and that is what has informed this, and it has informed this entire video. Moving on down to the fighter, and for the fighter we are assuming that they're using a longsword or rapier, so a D8 one-handed weapon. Presumably their other hand is open for spellcasting in the nature of the Eldritch Knight, or it's wearing a shield. And we are assuming for the primary numbers dueling. However, I have also provided in parentheses here the number without dueling, essentially. So we start off levels 1 to 3 at 9.5 or 7.5. Level 4 bumps up to 10.5 or 8.5. Levels 5 to 7 goes up to 21 or 17. 8 to 10 goes up to 23 or 19. Levels 11 to 16, 34.5 or 28.5, and at level 20, with the 4th attack, it goes up to 46 or 38. Now this is, again, in my opinion, a much more reasonable baseline. This is simple. Again, you don't have many assumptions. A fighter with a sword is going to try and hit something, and they've chosen the fighting style relevant for their weapon. Now there are other fighting styles you can choose. Of course, you could take defense, you could take superior technique, you could take interception, you could take protection. There are many other fighting styles you can choose, but fundamentally there are less fighting styles that you can choose than there are invocations you can choose. And all fighting styles are geared inherently towards combat, whereas invocations are not. It's a much simpler assumption, and again, the option to not have that fighting style is right there. This doesn't rely on special conditions being met other than hitting them in the face. It doesn't rely on resources. It doesn't rely on caveats or hand waving. It's just the average damage of making your attacks with a sword and a relevant fighting style, or without one. And in my opinion, if you wanted to use a baseline, if you wanted to have a generic damage touchstone reference point that you hold your builds up against, with the intent being, am I going to do enough damage that I'm not going to feel that I'm lagging behind, that I'm not being effectual at what I'm meant to be doing? This, I think, does it. I mean, yes, you could get higher numbers if you started going around with a greatsword, but that's also swingier numbers because you're relying on the dice more. And at the end of the day, I think more fighters are going to end up using D8 and below weapons for various reasons than going the other way. This is conservative. This is a safer assumption, and it's overall what I would recommend. I would actually recommend making this the baseline without dueling. If you want to make it more of an optimized baseline, use the dueling numbers. But I think if you are making a build that revolves around damage and at every point in your progression, as much as possible, this is another thing about baselines. You can dip in and out of the baseline. You don't need to be higher than it at all times, and it's okay to be skimming the baseline, be it above or below. If you can hang around in terms of damage with, some fighter using a sword and a shield, you're not going to feel lackluster. If you are, I would greatly encourage you to examine where your expectations are coming from. Are your expectations coming from hearing about these other builds? Are your expectations that the white room that you designed your character in is not playing out in person? Those are all different things, different problems to tackle. But if you want to use a baseline at all, it should be a conservative baseline with as few assumptions, and it should be as comparable as possible. And that, at the end of the day, is what a rogue or a fighter baseline gives you. You're not expending resources, you're not making a bunch of assumptions about, what class resources are chosen, expended, how many conditions are being met. At the end of the day, you want a baseline to be as simple and as conservative as possible because it is a baseline. And when you start going through, and that's really what this next point, this conclusion, is really what this video is about. When you start using baselines that are inherently problematic as a generic touchstone, and more importantly, when you start declaring that as your baseline without any caveats given, this is how much damage you should be doing so you can call yourself a damage dealer. You start giving inflated numbers and you start giving warped expectations to people. And this leads to people being dissatisfied with their characters purely because they're not hitting some numerical threshold that they probably didn't come up with to begin with. At the end of the day, in 5e, it's really hard to make a ineffectual character. It just is. And if you want to do damage and be effective in most games, especially in most written campaigns, you don't need to be doing super high damage numbers. You just don't. You don't need to be doing these numbers to feel like you're accomplishing things. And the reality is that with subclasses, with different resources, with just the roll of the dice, your numbers are going to go up and down all the time. You can have a good day, you can have a bad day, you can action surge, smite, whatever, get that lucky critical at essential moments, and despite not getting the baseline most of the time, when it actually matters, you can get that kill that seals the boss's fate. So don't fixate on baselines. I don't think it's a particularly healthy construct for the optimization community as a whole. I understand it. If we're going to be comparing things together, we should ideally have a metric to compare them with. But that metric should be used in context. This is a metric to be used in higher optimization context with the caveats that yes, it can fail at these various times. That's what you should be doing. If you want to create a generic baseline to just say to everybody, regardless of optimization, this is the damage you should be doing, it should have the least amount of assumptions possible, and it should be as conservative as possible, because otherwise what is the point? It's just going to make people feel bad about their characters, whilst other people are going to feel superior for no good reason. The point of the game is to have fun, and my takeaway from this video for you is that just consider, is using some baseline on the internet how you want to measure your character's effectiveness and how much fun you draw from your character. And if you want to use a baseline, please put a little thought into what baseline you actually use, so you're not setting yourself up for distorted high expectations and dissatisfaction down the line. But I've been Paul. If you enjoyed this video, I know it's a little longer, a little bit more just talky heady, then please like this video and just put your thoughts on the whole baseline discussion in the comments section down below. I know this isn't the most math heavy video. I hope that makes it both less prone to errors and more accessible. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Please hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Helps you know next time that we upload future content, and it does help grow the channel. Until next time, I've been Paul, and I will see you at the Forge.